All right. Well, I'm very excited about our speaker today. Many of you know Dr. Bill Allen. He is a developmental psychologist and the head of the developmental team at Cherokee Health Systems, where he has been for a number of years. And he's very well regarded throughout the state and in the region as an expert on autism, and is a huge supporter of children and really emphasizes children's strengths and their abilities. And he's a great teacher. So you are in for a treat. So I will turn it over to Dr. Allen.
Some of that's true. I got a lot to talk about, right? So there's autism, there's DSM-5 now with autism, just with the social communication. Social communication, sensory. Two big areas, right? And you can go back and read this later if you want, but it's boring, it's DSM. You know, it kind of says social and communication. And later I have some slides I like better that say autism-specific symptoms. And they'll go into social and sensory and communication. Social and communication kind of together, because you can't really communicate except to tell somebody something. I mean, if you're on an island by yourself, you're not really communicating when you're talking, because you're not really telling anybody anything. So it makes sense they put them together, but they got those two big things, right? There's the rate of incidence, right? Goes way up. Maybe we're diagnosing more with the Asperger-like kids, maybe. Public is aware, maybe, but there's a true increase. Autism is thought to be genetic susceptibility to whatever, we don't know, but you got to be susceptible to something. There's at least 6 research articles saying environmental toxins could be part of it, but there's other things too. There's other unusual things that may be part of it too. We do know environmental toxins are going up at that same rate. And there's some evidence about things like hair studies on mercury levels in kids and exposure to pesticides that are really scary, right? That kind of it's pretty well, but there's people in the profession claiming there's enough evidence now to say environmental toxins make it worse or cause it with the right genetics, right? Autism-specific symptoms. This all kind of boils down to that social communication stuff, right? Social communication stuff. There's a 3-second rule that we use when we look for showing and requesting eye contact, gestures, and voice. And they're all on there somewhere. But if I'm going to show you something, I'm going to say, hey, you want to see where I went for vacation? Cool. And I'm going to look at you and say it and show at the same time. If I have more trouble with social skills, I might be going, I went on a cool vacation. Or sometimes kids will go, see? And they're not really checking in with me. You know, I ought to pull you to it. I ought to go until you look, right? And I don't do that when I'm asking for something. Hey, can I borrow your pen? It takes the gesture, the voice, and the eye contact all together. And if I did it without the timing, you would notice. Like if I went, hey, can I borrow your pen? And looked at you that way, right? With that 6 or 7 second delay, it would feel odd. Right? So that's part of what we're looking for is the timing of all this, gestures. One of the best ways to learn about this part of communication is to go to a restaurant that's busy by yourself and sit where you can see all the people. You can't hear them. And you get to see people talk and use their eyes and their gestures and their voice, and you'll see what happens when somebody doesn't respond. Right? Like if somebody's showing and you're busy eating, you're going to see the guy go, and pull with his eyes. And you're going to see the gestures come right with the timing of everything. So I went to restaurants and studied. I also followed kids around sundown in the city. The old concert band, just watching. How did they use gestures, eye contact, and voice? And I never got arrested. I'm glad. I tried to be real subtle. So that voice, gesture, eye contact kind of stuff. I'm not going to read my slides to you, but I'm going to talk about some of the things on. Right? Imitating is a key skill. By 18 months, your babies ought to imitate. And they ought to respond to pointing in a number of ways. Like, the baby ought to be able to follow a point. If there's a bird, and they're not looking at your finger. They ought to be able to point to things they want. And they ought to be able to point things out to you to come at. See, he's got a camera. Not really wanting it. But there's another type of point. 18 months, they ought to do that kind of stuff, and they ought to do simple imitation, right? Most kids with autism spectrum, when they're 2 or 3, don't do much imitation. When a parent goes, nice job, you do it, the kid often doesn't, right? And that's a key thing that we work on looking at, but also teaching kids to imitate. Because the more they imitate, the easier it is to learn. It's a key teaching skill, right? The solitary play stands out, stuff like that. So that when we look at this stuff like the social interaction with peers, we're looking at when you're comfortable with a kid you like, right? And later when we get to what things kind of maybe overlap with autism, we'll see there's a lot of kids who have social difficulties. But when they're comfortable with a kid they like, they seem to be able to interact with them, right? And that is not autism, that almost rules it out. Joint attention is the 3-point gaze. You know what I'm saying? Hey, look up there, you see that up there? I think there's a bird. And I'm using my eyes. The 3 points technically ought to be my eyes, your eyes, and the bird. Right? That's joint attention. And it ought to come when you're asking for things. And we set up situations where kids have to ask us for things to see how they do it. Give them most of the pieces to a puzzle or something else, and when they have to ask, I want the gesture, voice, and eye contact in 3 seconds. I need some more pieces, please. You know, that kind of stuff. So that joint attention is key. Right? Repetitive. One thing about the repetitive stuff is that does not cover asking for what you want. It does not cover going, but I want to play my video game. No, you can't play anything. But I want to play. It does not count that. It does not count. But I want more Coke. But I want more Coke. But I want more Coke. Give me that, give me that, give me that, give me that. It doesn't really count. Right? A lot of it's odd kind of repetitive stuff. Echolalia, that's where you go to the kids with a language level under about 100 words ought to echo. When you go, I see a ball, they ought to go ball. But by the time they have hundreds and hundreds of words, they shouldn't go in response to your question, do you want a cookie? Do you want a cookie? That's echoing, right? There's delayed echoing, that's where you repeat something you heard earlier. And another version of that is script quoting. Dora says hola, or whatever you hear from the video, right? So there's some odd communication, social stuff. These are the kind of autism-specific symptoms that usually don't happen with other types of conditions that overlap. Those last two, this stuff right here, this again comes with when they're comfortable with someone they like, right? So I have kids who have other things going on, who seem to completely lack empathy, or to be mean, or to cause harm on purpose. But when they're comfortable, and it's a kid they like, we're hoping we can see some good conversation skills, some good imitation skills, some good back and forth play, turn taking, and stuff like that. We hope to see them start interaction with that kid they feel comfortable with. Not just wait and play by themselves for the kid to come and say, hey, come play, but to go up to the kid and say, let's play Legos, right? So, does anybody here have sensory sensitivities? You guys raise your hand, every one of you. You all do, you all do, I'm sorry. Okay, now raise your hand if you're sensitive to the sound of fingernails on a blackboard. Right, there we go, I got more than half. More than half of you. Okay, is there anybody here who has no response to that noise? It doesn't bother us. They're abnormal, we're not. There is no adaptive reason for y'all to freak out with that noise, I'm sorry. There is no reason. Like, it's not like a pterodactyl's gonna pick us off. It's probably left over from that, I don't know. But that's an abnormal fight or flight reaction that really does not save your skin. And I cannot reward or punish you out of it, can I? I'll give you $50 if you don't shiver when I do it. No, I get that, it's not gonna help. You might fake it. Okay, how about anybody ticklish? Okay, we pretty much got everybody now. Is there anybody here who's not the least ticklish? Oh, there's at least one. That's the norm. And my older brother's not the least bit ticklish. Nothing tickles him. And some people, anything tickles. So that's the norm. Because like, that is not really going to hurt you. Why are the rest of us crying and fighting you off when you tickle us? We do that. Like, we fight or flight to something that really should not really hurt you. So there's a functional brain, and here's a sensory sensitivity leading to fight or flight. That's really kind of odd, right? Now imagine that we take all of that and make it happen all the time. Like instead of fingernails on a blackboard, it's any unexpected noise. And any touch. And maybe any odor, or busy place, or smelly commotion place, like a lunchroom, or a cafeteria, or a gym. Cafeterias and gyms are the places you do inclusion first with special needs kids, and they're chaos machines. And some kids do great there, but they're sensory chaos machines. So there are sensory sensitivities that involve fight or flight reactions that get triggered a lot. And there's also some odd repetitive types of behaviors, absorbing types of things. Both of those kind of fall together. Repetitive things can be flapping, or twiddling, or pacing, or some kids with autism spectrum will pace back and forth a lot repetitively, or do circus repetitively, or line up cars or trucks repetitively, or dangle strings, or do stuff like that, repetitive stuff. There are some repetitive acts that we all do, right? So people will do this, or kick their leg in a meeting. There we go. I knew I could find somebody if I looked around. There's other people doing it too. That's a self-stimulatory thing that helps you modulate, and it's pretty cool. It works, right? So for me, when I'm in meetings and I get bored, I'm doing this stuff. Like this stuff. Or maybe try not to get bored as much, and it's kind of just the same as any other kind of self-stimulatory stuff. So if you went to Luttrell Elementary School, where Kenny Chesney went to school, and you say, guess what, kids, Kenny's coming today. Half the third graders would flap. Meaning they'd go, Kenny Chesney's coming here? So a certain amount of sensory overload like that with excitement is not necessarily alarming. The most alarming repetitive stuff like that, that's the one that kind of you might see the most often. But if it happens after about 8 or 9, it starts to stand out more, and if it happens with boredom, it stands out a lot. So the kid who rocks when they're anxious doesn't stand out as much to me as the kid who's just bored and who's doing that stuff, right? That stands out a lot more. So if you have some of those behaviors when you're mad, it may not stand out as much to me as if you're bored. Or if you're happy, excited, it may not stand out as much to me as if you're bored. Or as you get older, it doesn't stand out as much either. Sensory sensitivities. So everybody has some, and everybody has absorbing interests, right? Like, has anybody seen the synchronous fireflies in the Smokies? Yes. Pretty cool, right? It's like you get kind of giddy and almost intoxicated feeling. They all flash at exactly the same time. A campfire, a waterfall, maybe a ballet if you like that, and you're sitting and watching it, you're going to forget that your shoes are too tight or whatever. So we can all get like absorbed in the senses and tune out other things. So rolling wheels is kind of a classic example, or doing stuff like that. That's kind of an absorbing interest, and we all have minor versions of that, right, where we can tune out. So there's some really good training. I'm not going to show you these videos, but this is on the CDC website. And people can get continuing ed training for watching these videos. There's one set up for healthcare providers, and physicians can get CMUs for it. And there's another set up for teachers, and they can get their continuing ed credits. And they're really good videos. They're really good. They're really informative. They're really well done. You see some really good examples of stuff. The videos are really clear. It's really good stuff. If you need to get like a really good background in autism spectrum, this is where we send people. And we train our pediatricians in autism every few years. We give them an hour update on neurology and genetics and medications. But we tell them, before you come, you got to watch some of this stuff. Just brush up a little bit. But again, they get the CMUs for it, which is great. And they have to have some of those. So you can find it under CDC, Autism Case Training Modules, if you Google that. It's a little harder to find elsewhere because they have so much stuff on their website related to autism. But once you get to autism case training, you can go to the web-based part and watch the videos. They're very good. We know it's genetic, right? Last count, there was somewhere over 100 different genetic abnormalities, which doesn't really help us, right? It'd be nice if it was one, like Down syndrome. And none of those 100% predict autism. There's a lot of them where you can have them and have nothing wrong. There's a lot of them where you can have them and you have stuff wrong, but it might be developmental disability or autism. But there's not one yet where it says, oh, you have that, 90% chance you have autism or 99. So it really, but we're convinced now that it's definitely genetic. Some of the studies have found in big groups of kids, genetic abnormalities in 96% of the kids studied, of autistic kids. And you know what that means? They missed 4%, because they're there. They're there, right? That's what it means. Neurological for sure. Some key neurological stuff. You all have Purkinje cells, even though you don't know it. I had to go learn how to say that word. I talked to, okay, these are cells that go through your cerebral cortex. Everything you have goes through them, everything you process. And there's not as many in autism. Like half the highways are gone now. Right? There's also a tendency for a brain overgrowth, meaning a percentage of autistic-like kids start off with slightly enlarged heads when they're born, and it goes to 99th percentile by 6 or 7 months, and settles down to 90% maybe later. And it's like the brain grew too quickly. When your brain's growing as an infant, you're supposed to prune away a lot of stuff, like get rid of the connections that don't help you. And if you don't get rid of those, you have a lot of chaos. And so there's some evidence of a lack of pruning away of stuff that leads to more chaos, like the sensory stuff is more chaotic and not as tolerable or processable, maybe. Right? Again, there's compelling evidence of the role of toxins to the point where we're recommending to families filter drinking and cooking water, but be sure it has fluoride toothpaste. We got to throw that last part in because we got dentists in our office. And they're right. If we just filter the water and take the fluoride out, we're going to have a lot more cavities lately. And some of these kids don't do dental treatments well. My organic and anything the kid eats, thin skinned fruits and vegetables, and a multivitamin. B vitamins help your body get rid of toxins. There's no evidence yet that says if you do that, your kid's going to get better. But I'm asking you to spend $20 a month, maybe. A Brita filter, a multivitamin, maybe organic grapes. A lot of these kids don't eat fruits and vegetables. But we don't know if that'll help. We do know if you live within 1.5 miles of one particular pesticide, the California Department of Health will tell you you have a 50% increase in your chance of a neurodevelopmental disability in your kid. It's not as bad as it sounds. It sounds horrendous, but it's like, if it's 1 in 59, now it's 1.5 in 59. It's still an increase, but to me it sounds like, oh my gosh, that's 25 more kids. No, it's just a little, but it is significant, meaning you should move. Right? Now we don't know if it's a pesticide. Maybe the people who moved into there in the early days had these genes going on, you know, and they settled it, and they're now all, that's what we're measuring, so we don't know for sure in that research study. All we know is it seems to be a correlation in that one sample done by the California Department of Health. I mean, I count on them. There are some websites I don't count on. There are websites now that are still saying immunizations will cause autism. So, in very rare conditions with a mitochondrial disorder, that's really rare, that's in every cell in your body, a vaccination might cause some really weird reactions. And they've been sometimes labeled autism, and some of those kids got money. But that's really rare. That's not really the norm for autism, is to see that. I encourage people to get vaccinated, and I take the flu shots and stuff like that. I passed my measles test. I didn't have to take it. You know what I mean? They check to see if you're... We know it's developmental as well, right? We try to make sure we get a comprehensive evaluation on kids. And there are models that just do a questionnaire and an interview, but we're trying to do this like AGOS. The Vanderbilt people train people on the AGOS, and they're going to come to our office on October 3rd and 4th and train people again. This will be the 3rd time, and they'll sell it to people for like $300, and you can come and learn it in your entirety. And they'll sell it to, mostly they don't sell it to psychologists, but they're also inviting school special ed staff and speech language therapists and other people to come learn it. October 3rd and 4th in Cherokee, and so it's a really cool test. It's a very hard test too. So we're trying to do all that stuff before we diagnose, right, to be thorough. Now there's a bunch of things we see where kids come in and somebody goes, I think he has autism, and in the end we go, no, he doesn't have autism. Right, so these are the major things that happens with. So we have ID, intellectual disabilities, right? Or when they're younger, we might call it severe developmental delay. Sometimes people mistake that for autism. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of parents who would prefer to have the diagnosis of autism than ID. It gets you a lot more, it gets you a lot more sympathy. But that's not really why we do it. But it also is kind of like, a lot of people who have a child with autism feel more relieved to the fact that maybe it was something they did or caused or sent to the child. When we look at developmental delays in autism, when we have a 4-year-old and they're at a 2-year level, when we're looking at their social skills, they have to be way below a 2-year level. So we got ID kids who come in who are 4, but really everything's 2, and their social skills look like a 2-year-old. We don't call them autism spectrum disorder. So one of the ways we separate those is your social skills have to be more delayed than everything else. We have to be able to find that, and we got the ADOS and observations and parent report and some rating scales to do that. Most of my DD kids or ID kids, when they're with kids at their developmental level, can have a decent interaction. They can take turns, they can imitate, they can join in conversation up to their language level. They don't freak out with sensory stuff nearly as much or do as much repetitive stuff. The one exception is really severely ID kids, who might have an IQ of 50 or 40. That would be your 12-year-old who's nonverbal and not toilet trained. Those kids often do a lot of repetitive behaviors and avoid people. And if they have IQs that low, we don't add autism spectrum to the teenagers. Right? We use this behavioral assessment system for children, and some of your other people can use it. Mental health people can use it. Master level social workers can use it. We send it online to parents and teachers, and we look at different scores. There's 2 in particular that the DD kids don't show positive on. The kids do atypicalities, being off the page, doing your own thing, quirky, weird, absorbed, repetitive. Not attuned to what's going on around him in his own world. And withdrawal means just kind of on his own way too much. Doesn't join in, play, doesn't do chase games, doesn't do ball play, doesn't do copycat play. And so the DE kids usually don't show up on those scales. They usually do join in the playground. They run with the other kids and chase and stuff like that. And they usually don't show that odd, atypical, tuned out stuff. Right? And we get better eye contact. Shared enjoyment is just having fun together. Right? So if one kid gets a toy and does something with it, and they look at the other one and laugh and look at the toy, that's shared enjoyment. And there's a 3-point gaze that shows us that. We check it in the office with things like a balloon. Blow up a balloon and let the air out, and the kid ought to go, oh, didn't you see that? That kind of thing, right? So we look for those kinds of things. Directed facial expressions, that's when you make a face and do it at somebody. So you don't just go, man, that snack was gross, I don't know what was in there. You go, what do you think was in there? Right? So that's a dirty, yuck. And we can get it, and we do little conversational tasks with kids. Like, hey, do you have any pets? Yeah, I have 3 pets. That's the kid speaking. Answer. Oh, what kind are they? I got a dog, he's really nice. So answering the question and adding details leads away from autism. Asking me questions does too. So after I get a kid going about pets, I go, oh, well, I have 3 pets. I'm supposed to wait 10 seconds without making any movement. It's really hard. Right about now, I'm going, man, the shoe should have dropped. It's uncomfortable. I'm not feeling it. Somebody's got to say something. But that's what most of us would feel, right? And most kids go, oh, what are they? And look at me. Or they guess, right? And I'm supposed to get a directed facial expression. So I say, one's a cat and one's a dog. And they go, what's the other one? And I go, it's a flying squirrel. And they're supposed to go, what? Like that, right? Okay, I do have a flying squirrel for a pet, but that doesn't matter. Like surprise them. So when I talk about pizza and get conversation going, I'm supposed to get a directed facial expression. You'll never guess what I like on pizza. Mushrooms, pineapple, and mustard. See, I do not like that. But I'm getting a directed facial expression. Okay? So that's what that means. And you'll see on some of these slides, conversation, directed facial expression come up again and again, right? Sensory processing disorder can happen without autism. It can happen with prenatal substance exposure. All that stuff. The not liking noises, the not liking touch, the repetitive movements, the staring at things too long, that can all come with prenatal substance exposure. So right now we have already like a third overlap between the 2 conditions, right? It can also happen with prematurity, right? A baby born weighing 1.5 pounds. The sensory system is not meant to deal with the senses that flood it. And the nurseries are a lot better now than they were years ago. I mean, they got dim lights and stuff like that, and one baby and all kinds of things to make the preemie baby less overly stimulated. But those preemie babies, if you do this on their skin, it'll turn red, just like that. That's very little stimulation to lead to a fight or flight kind of reaction. So, And there's some theories that exposure to toxins might cause sensory processing problems. Some of this comes from a mercury accident in Japan, where there was a lot of mercury released, and they studied some of the families nearby, and it seemed like there was a correlation that those families were more likely to have autistic-like kids. Or, no, I'm sorry, sensory processing symptoms in their kids. Not autism, but sensory. That was years ago. I wonder now if they make a connection with autism. The sensory processing kids have all that fight or flight, but if you put them in a quiet, safe, comfortable place with a kid they like who's not overwhelmingly sensory, then they typically don't stand out as much with things like imitation, pretend play, conversational skills. Those are some of the key terms for those autism-specific stuff. So the kid with the sensory processing may freak out in the classroom, may not want to join in at all because it's so noisy, may hate to go to the lunchroom, may not like you to touch him, may cover his ears a lot. But if we get him off in a quiet, safe place with a kid that's not too busy, noisy, smelly, kids are sensory chaos machines, and the younger you go, the more they are. So if we get some of that out of the way, we can see if this sensory processing kid can do imitation, pretend play. We look for any stuff like that. We even sometimes think, see if you can make him copycat play, because kids get that thing on the right way when I want. And so they'll take the farm animals and try to get the kid to try to do farm animal play or whatever else. Or march and jump and do a thumbs, any kind of imitation. Pretend play is rare in autism spectrum. That takes some social understanding. If I can imagine being that horse and walking and jumping. And usually our sensory processing kids don't stand out too bad on the social skills scale. They might show up on atypicality because some of that sensory weird stuff may be picked up. They tend to show socially they're okay and they join in okay in some situations. So we're using that mask, and as a matter of fact, if you've got clinics you work with, then you should ask them to do that, or if you can do it, master's level social workers can get trained and from there. Anxiety disorders, a big group of kids that get sent to us. When they're comfortable and a kid, have you heard me say that before? When they're comfortable with a kid they like, we tend to see the good social skills, right? It was a pretend play, imitation, communication, conversation stuff, right? Autistic avoidance in my office is the kid who stays away from me, but wanders freely around the room and doesn't look at me. And when I try to interact with them, runs back to their mom and hides. Shyness in an anxiety kid is being behind your mom and keeping your eyes on me most of the time. And so shyness and autistic avoidance look different. But there are socially anxious kids who are often mistaken for autistic-like kids because they really don't want to interact with other people. Those kids also tend to have a whole range of anxiety symptoms, right? It's not just kids, and kids are harder than adults. Adults work you. So if you're anxious, you're going to be more anxious with kids, but you're also tend to be anxious with the dark, storms, bugs, bees, spiders, and other change. Change can be autism, but it can be anxiety disorder. If you predict a safe way through things, your anxiety is less. So, there's anxiety scales on the mask. You know, typically in these kids, we can sort them out pretty easy with masks. Because usually they don't show all that atypical, weird, tuned out, repetitive, bizarre stuff, but they show a lot of nervousness about a wide range of things. Right? OCD really is related to anxiety. There's a difference between absorbing interests and obsessions. Technically, obsessions are used to bind anxiety. I do it when I'm worried. I check the lock 3 times and I walk back and forth and touch the door, and I have to do it to take 2 steps forward and 1 step back and things like that. When I'm anxious, it comes out even more. So obsessions are anxiety binding. Absorbing interests are things you love, right? So absorbing interests are common in autism, like Thomas the Train or sharks, or history, or just bizarre specific topics like that, things that spin, right? Music maybe, video credits maybe, stuff like that. But one problem, tech toys don't count. If you're obsessed or absorbed by tech toys, you do not get any points on the autism scale. If you're obsessed by the history of presidents, you get a point. If you're obsessed by all the different types of sharks there are in the world, you get a point. If you're obsessed by Thomas or lining things up, you get a point. But if you're obsessed by your iPad, tech toy, cell phone, you get no points. And sometimes parents come in saying, I think he has autism because he has bad temper tantrums and he can't put his cell phone down. And I say, okay, so far you have no autistic symptoms to give me, none. Able to socialize comfortably. These kids, if they're just OCD, they ought to be able to show me those conversation, social interaction skills in a setting where they're comfortable, right? Behavior disorders, conduct disorders. Hey, look, if you're intentionally manipulative, you lose points on the autism scale. And we get referrals from psychiatrists commonly that say, he doesn't care about other people's feelings and he's very manipulative. No points on the autism scale yet. Being manipulative does take social awareness. Autistic-like kids sometimes manipulate people, but it's not usually because they set out to say, you know, I know what's in your head. And if I do this, I know how I can change what's in your head to do what I want. They don't, if their manipulation is because they're having a long temper tantrum and nobody knows what to do and they finally give in and feel manipulated. So if they intentionally set about with a plan to manipulate, don't think autism. You should be thinking, wait a minute, that doesn't fit the puzzle yet. Maybe there's more to it. And I'm not saying my kids can't, because later you'll see a slide where it can say, guess what? Nature's cool, you can have all this stuff. Almost never can have all of them. You can certainly have 2 of them, right? Behavior disorder kids, if it's, they tend to be, when I ask parents, when he's with a kid he likes, can he have a decent conversation? They go, oh yeah. When he's with a kid he likes, he's great at conversation. He's able to ask questions, take turns, laugh, make jokes, gets it. But you put him in a group and everything blows up. Pretend plays commonly done in these kids. They tend to be really good at it. They might do superhero play and make a fight and crash. But fewer sensory issues. There's a couple scales on the mask called aggression and conduct disorder. Tend to be really high in those kids, and the atypical, weird, bizarre tend to not be. Right? One of the problems we have is that first item. We get a lot of people come in who say, I think he has autism because he has a bad temper tantrum. No points. You know why? I got autistic-like kids who have no temper issues at all. None. It's not a defining characteristic. Now, life is frustrating when you have sensory overload a lot. And you don't understand social communication very well, so that's not helping you. And you can have some pretty bad temper tantrums. And I've got kids who've had some record temper tantrums. But that by itself, alone, does not lead to autism. We got to look at some of that other stuff. I get parents and providers as well who say, when I say, well, what's the reason you think he has autism? Temper tantrum. Anything else? Well, no, not really. They're just really bad temper tantrums. We think of them as meltdowns instead of temper tantrums. You lose points for that. If you're saying there's a difference between a temper tantrum and a sensory meltdown, you're assuming your child is a machine. And we are much more complicated than that. So any misbehavior in an autism spectrum kid is sensory and behavioral, built on consequences or getting reactions. So it's always both. Right? He bangs his head when he's mad to let off frustration, he's overwhelmed, and he notices you act different. And people are complicated enough where it's always both. Right? So I can't say, oh, it's a sensory thing or a temper tantrum. I think some people say when it gets to the point of being uncontrollable, we call it a meltdown. What I want to be careful about is if you treat a temper tantrum with sensory interventions, you are rewarding or making the temper tantrum functional. So what a lot of people get wrong is they say, oh, it's a sensory meltdown. I need to go and give him joint compressions and do the brushing and give him the squish toys and stuff like that, bear hugs. Okay, now if you need your sensory needs met, and it takes a tantrum to get them met, then tantrum, please. That's how it works. So once they start a tantrum, I have to stop all the sensory interventions. They're preemptive. They got to be done preemptively beforehand, before the child escalates or in the early stages of escalation. But if they're done later, I'm in trouble. Now, I can design a timeout area that's also a sensory protected calm down area. So when I send kids to timeout, usually it's a cubby without a lot of commotion, 2 big beanbag chairs, a stuffed animal or 2, a blanket, and a pair of mother's pajamas. Those are sensory calming things. None of that is something you will tantrum for, and none of it will hurt me if you throw it at me. So there's a sensory calm down area compared to a chair in the corner. Two big beanbag chairs behind a divider in a cubby with a sensory, if you like the stuffed animals or the blankets, and if it's at home, the pajamas, maybe not at school. The two big beanbag chairs allow you to cut out more sensory stimulation. Sight and sound are the worst, so crawling between them is a good idea. And you get deep pressure all over you. And you can pound on them, and pounding on that beanbag chair is a form of deep pressure compared to pounding on the table, when it soaks up more energy. So I do kind of account for it with the timeout, but I really don't want to go and say, oh, we got to give you joint compressions, and I see that happening at school and at home, right? So the behavioral kids don't have all that sensory stuff going on usually. We see pretend play normally, and again, it's really aggressive pretend play, right? Trauma and attachment disorder, we send those to you guys. But they can cause a lot of issues that overlap with autism. They can cause social difficulties, and if you have trouble bonding with your mom and bonding with people in general, you may look like you don't care about people. But generally, the kids we see with trauma, in a setting where they're comfortable, can do some turn-taking, have a basic conversation, can do a little pretend play with the kid, can imitate the kid, and can do some of that stuff when they're calm that looks like more typical social play, at least up to their language level. Some of our kids with trauma maybe have a lower language level, maybe not. Some of them, most of them will use these social graces like social smile, gestures, directed facial expressions. You can't make me get right at you. It's a directed facial expression, right? Doesn't rule out autism if they do it, but it gets you losing points on the scale, right? So I'm looking for that kind of stuff to see if I can tell the difference. Most kids come in my office and I do parent and teacher rating scales. Most kids behave worse for their parents. All three of mine do. And all three of them behave worse for my wife than me. And I don't say that to brag. She's primary. So usually the primary gets it the worst, and then the secondary caretakers get it next, and teachers get it last. A lot of these kids, the parents rate them hugely worse, and the teachers say there's nothing wrong. We pretty much insist on teacher rating scales on most of our kids. They're in school. Because you can dump a lot of stuff on your mom that you don't take to school. And if you don't take it to school, it doesn't look like autism. Autism has to show up in all settings all the time. And sometimes I ask parents, you know, today at his best he did this, this, and this. At his best, do you think he usually can? They go, yeah, he doesn't look so. Well, the child with autism at his best still does odd things, right? You still should see that communication, conversation stuff. The history of trauma helps us. But not a whole lot. Not a whole lot, because how much more likely are children with autism to have a traumatic experience? I think it's 4 times. I think I read recently a child with autism, and I'm not quite sure, maybe 2 times, but more likely to have trauma. And I'd like to be able to say, oh, if you got a history of trauma, good, we can rule out autism. Maybe the trauma caused it all. And sometimes the trauma can be real extreme. There's a term, post-institutional response syndrome or something like that, was used in the literature. Extreme deprivation can look just like autism. Like I got a girl who was raised in an orphanage in China and she was HIV positive. Had almost no stimulation for 2 years. She looks autistic. She doesn't socialize. She doesn't respond to stimulation the same way. She doesn't respond to her parents the same way. She's not bonding the same way. She doesn't get pretend play. All that stuff. And it's probably from that extreme amount of deprivation. You know, with that condition, she probably saw masked faces with her conditions, not just no toys. So. But it takes a lot of that kind of stuff before it's going to look like autism. And so we've got to be careful. We have to, when we're diagnosing, we have to be really careful not to put a bias in the way. Like, oh, there's trauma. Maybe that explains it. Well, also maybe it caused it, right? Okay, I yelled at all my kids when I was raising them. I knew better, but I did. I mean, sometimes you get so mad, you do. Imagine if they're 10 times as hard, right? And 10 times as long, and they're fighting you all the time. It's like, okay, if your stress level is going up and you're having trouble, this is going to be a good challenge for you to keep your cool, right? So I think it's like part of the trauma may be because of the extreme difficulties of some types of management, right? Whether the aggression or the training. So, and there's cases we've seen where kids have had some trauma from their autism that was not intentional. Right? A kid was attacking his granddad, and Dad stopped him, and Dad broke his arm. But there was a DCS investigation. The family started. It was pretty clear what happened. Dad stopped him. Dad held his arm up, and the kid's arm came down on Dad's arm. Dad's arm was stronger. Would that count as trauma? Well, the whole situation was probably traumatic to be that mad and attacking. So, prenatal substance exposure. We see probably a third of the kids we see in our office, maybe not quite that many, maybe a quarter, are NAS kids who somebody thinks has autism. And if you have NAS, you almost never get a diagnosis of autism. You still can, because the criteria don't say rule out that stuff, right? They just say count your symptoms. But most of our NAS babies don't, they have the social stuff going on. And that substance exposure, I mentioned before, can cause a lot of the sensory stuff. So they might flap, they might turn in circles, they might line up toys, they might repeat themselves, they might hate noises and hate touch and not want to get finger paint or food or ketchup on themselves.
Dr. Allen?
Yes.
How early are you seeing on onset of some of those, that kind of manifestation with NAS?
Oh, birth.
I'm sorry?
From birth.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, there's some from birth who can't handle stimulation. And you have the regulation. NAS causes a lot of regulation problems. And that's usually the NAS kids have trouble with sleep no matter what we do. They sleep 5 or 6 hours a night, they have trouble falling asleep, they have trouble with arousal and stuff like that. And a lot of those kind of symptoms, the self-regulation with sleep and the sensory sensitivity show up from birth.
But some of that stuff falls off.
It does fall off, that's right.
But
There's compelling evidence.
it sustains is what you're, or is that what you're?
No, a lot of the NAS babies, if you protect them from abnormal stressors, by the time they're 5 or 6, their brains look much more like normal. There's some 2 major studies that show that. One done in Indiana on the whole state. They gathered data on thousands and thousands of kids. And we were expected to hear, oh, those babies have a low IQ when they're 6. They did not. And their IQs went up over time. And it mattered whether or not they were in abnormal stressors, right? Normal stressors, like at my house lately, might be, oh, we got a flat tire. Who's going to be able to take the car in? How do we work that? The dog's got to go to the vet. But it's not things like, nobody's here to take care of the kids. What do we do? There's no food or toys or money, or there's too much anger or absence.
Do you mean like ACEs, stressors?
Yeah, right. And so if you add all that stuff on it, it seems to increase the chances you're solidifying the brain damage. Right? So we got good evidence that these kids, the ones we're seeing, are 2, 3, 4. That's when people think they're autistic like. It's rare. Now I do see some who are 5, 6, 7 who still have all those self-regulation and sensory issues, whose brains haven't healed. And part of that's resilience and luck of the draw. I mean, some brains respond better and some worse to everything. And so I think there are some NAS babies who, no matter what we do, are going to have some issues. And there's apparently some who have no issues. I got a kid who was taken out of his home at 4 with such a bad infection, his eye was removed. And he had no words at 4. And he's a gentleman. He cleaned up my room. He said, oh, we're done playing? I'll put all the toys away. And he was super polite and everybody loves him. And he has no sign of stress. I mean, this kid has a right to be mad. And he's not. He's a gentleman. So I'm checking him for developmental delay. Nobody's thinking autism. No, there's some resilience. Right? Really what you all need is like an hour-long conversation about how do you build resilience in kids? What makes people more resilient? And we could probably come up with lots of answers. But a lot of these babies, the NAS babies, are manipulative with their temper outbursts. You know, sometimes we can see that. We can usually find up to their developmental level some pretend play and some communication stuff. Sometimes it's one thing. So what do you want to talk about for 10 minutes?
I have a question.
Good.
About
Because I'll talk anyway.
about some of the signs that you were talking about, like the lining things up or walking on tiptoes. I mean, at what age are you kind of applying that to. The reason I'm asking is I personally have an almost 2-year-old, and sometimes he'll take his trains and line them up, and every once in a while he walks on his toes for a second, but he doesn't like do it all the time.
No, the best example I have that I give parents a lot is about spinning yourself around. Almost all 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds will spin themselves around for 20, 30, 40, 60 seconds, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 2 or 3 times a day. So lining up trains, okay, what do trains do? What do cars do? They line up. So a certain amount of aligning things is normal.
He likes to park his car.
See, and if he's pretending to park, that's different than just lining things up. Another thing about lining things up is that if it's functional, I ought to be able to pick a car up at one end and go, hey, you know what, this car can go over here. And the kid ought to go, cool, rather than, So flexibility and pretend play thrown in with that lining up do not worry me as much. Blocks can be lined up a little more than some other things, but the kids who have autistic-like symptoms are going to line up a lot of things all the time.
Not just their trains at the airport.
Usually parents will come in and show me a picture of a line of cars going all the way around the floor and say, you cannot touch any of them. And they'll say, when we go in Walmart, all the cans have to face the right way. Yeah.
My son, when he was a baby, I was feeding him a bottle, and you know, I'd catch him looking at me. But when I looked in his eyes, and he's 27 now, but that was my first.
And there are people who just don't make good eye contact. You know some of them, right? I know one. He teaches music at Jeff County High School. He's a great guy. He's a really good drummer too. He likes Miles Davis, but he won't look at you, or almost never. But you know, when I look at him, he does great conversation. You know, he makes faces and he's looking toward me when he does it. He asks questions, he responds to what I'm saying. He doesn't change the topic, he doesn't have any unusual behaviors besides liking Miles Davis.
No.
We got a whole section of Miles Davis down the road at the Caves. So I'm going to get some on the way home. I don't know where that came from. The eye contact alone, you know, unmodulated eye contact gets you on the autism spectrum. It should be modulated and used to communicate and not just looking like this all the time. And so unmodulated eye contact counts as an autism symptom. There was a time when we thought if you made eye contact, you couldn't be autistic-like. Now we realize it's just the modulation of it, like it ought to be used more functionally to express and make a point and gesture and draw your attention and look at things, right? So we used to also think if you wanted a friend, you couldn't be on the spectrum, but now we're pretty sure that some of our higher functioning kids do want friends. And there was a point when people thought if you were loving, you couldn't be autistic-like. Like if you like to cuddle your parents, the majority of them do. So, I got a kid at UT Knoxville, he's a freshman, you can't take him out. The only problem he had starting as a freshman was his expectations about social relations. So his dad had him come to see me just to talk before he went. He didn't really need to come. I said, how long do you think it'll be as a freshman before you have a friend you can go out to lunch with? He said, maybe a couple weeks. I said, how long before a date? Maybe a month. I said, okay, you know what? Most freshmen find it can take anywhere from a couple of weeks to all year to have a friend they can go out to lunch with. And so maybe you should think about that as just a different time span. Because it does take some people all year. Because everybody's busy and got to find a friend. And the same goes for dating. A lot of people find they don't have a date until the end of the first year, maybe. So maybe it'll be a month, maybe it'll be the end of the year, but you won't be disappointed if you have some different kinds of expectations. And he's real social, or seems to be very gregarious. He changes the subject to his favorite interest a lot. You know, there's a lot of people in college who do that. The more you go into college, the more you ought to be absorbed by your interests or obsessed, right? So I got a friend who knows more about snakes than almost anybody, and sooner or later we'll talk about snakes. Senior class president at West High School with Asperger's, you would not know it. He's obsessed by the history of presidents, and he wears a shirt with the president on it every day. And when he was in middle school, the other 8, 9, 10-year-olds thought it was weird to talk about the history of presidents. Like they'd be saying, let's go pretend we're riding horses. And he would go, Jefferson had horses. 32 of them. He had a stable and he was born. Now in high school, the kids go, the guy's a genius. We like him, let's put him on the scholarship bowl. Right? And so he stands out in a cool way. And he's a little geeky, But you know what? Really, go to the university. Really smart people can be geeky, right? Questions?
How do these symptoms transform over time? Like, that is, from young childhood to adolescence.
Oh, that's a good question. There's a lot of stuff in the research that tells people you do not outgrow autism. That is wrong. We have compelling evidence and publications now where people are saying sometimes it gets mild enough where you lose the symptoms. So we got this whole spectrum, and we got full autism and high functioning autism, and there's a gap there. Like, you're not bad enough to be disabled, but you're still a little geeky, a little specific about things, a little overly sensitive to crowds, but that's all that's left. And you can live independently, hold a job, go to school. So we see kids get past the diagnostic point to the point where I think with a magnifying glass I can find their symptoms, but their neighbors can't. And we see kids who get to that point. The 2 kids I mentioned are there, and there's compelling publications now by other professionals saying it looks like some people do improve enough to look smart and geeky, not Asperger's, right? And smart and geeky is cool as an adult, and it's not as a child. Being a little geeky will get you picked on at 8 and will get you admired at 18. So some of it's that part of it. So we hope the symptoms will improve at 2, 3, 4. Usually if they make a jump, they make bigger and bigger jumps from then on. About a third of my kids never make progress at all. So there's about a quarter to a third who don't talk and have significant developmental delays all their lives, no matter what we do. And some of those kids got everything, and it just didn't help. And what percent live independently and hold a job? In one research article, it said 50%. And that was done on kids who were adults now, meaning they got help 30 years ago when it wasn't as early to get help. So there's some evidence saying a significant proportion can improve enough to live independently and hold a job they enjoy.
So did the article reference aging out and aging out with interventions? I mean, looking at populations or control groups to look at
That would
those?
be interesting. I don't know that the publications did that, but you know what we see is that sometimes when you lose the diagnosis of autism, it might be a diagnosis of ADHD after that. That might be what the symptoms look like, or it might be an anxiety disorder. And we see kids go from changing diagnosis from autism spectrum high functioning to a 10, 11, 12, 14 ADHD or anxiety.
We see kids aging out of conduct disorder in juvenile. And they'll age out, and that trajectory will take them in a different direction because they age out of those kind of antisocial behaviors and don't move into a more conduct disorder versus antisocial.
Yeah, and you know that aging out, that's really the miracle of child development. That's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
The way kids can learn and change and grow is miraculous. The way they can learn language, go back and try to learn it now. The way they can learn all kinds of things as quickly as they do, there's miracles, and part of that's resilience and healing and recovery. So, yes?
I'm thinking of one child in particular, but...
I'm sorry, it's 1 o'clock, we have to stop.
But does it matter why, okay, like for instance, when he sees you, he smiles. But I almost take it because, like, we suspect, we're getting it tested, we suspect that there may be some autism. He'll smile when he sees you, but it's almost like I feel like he thinks he's supposed to, you know? Because if he does have it, he's high functioning.
Yeah.
Also, like his foster mom, he never hugged her, never anything like that. Now there's another child in the home. He's like, observe that child hugging her. So now he follows, almost like, he follows right behind that child and will hug her, but still it's like, so uncomfortable to watch. It's like he knows he's supposed to.
It doesn't look like it's normal time, yeah.
He definitely, I mean, and there's many symptoms, it's not just those,
Yeah.
but it's obviously not like a reciprocal emotional swing.
Right, and reciprocal emotional. And you know, the kids may smile simply because they know they're going to get something good out of you while they're there. Like, you know, you're going to give them a couple of hugs and you're going to be gentle and you're going to have a toy. Or something like that. But the smile making for them. We're talking for what's called a social smile, which means that they look at me and they're not smiling. When I smile, they should instantly smile. So we look for that. He's beating you to it sometimes.
Yeah, he doesn't look at you like at all. Like he'll look in your direction and smile.
Yeah, see, that doesn't really count.
See, that's right.
That could be a learned response, or for any
Yeah.
reason, like that's, I know what I'm supposed to do, or it could simply be, I just want to do something come out of this.
So if it's like learned.
Right, like, it could be a learned behavior, sure. Kids can learn to say broccoli, hello, and goodbye, too, still have we're running out of time, y'all can feel free to get off and leave. I'll take one more question.
I have a question. Are you putting Asperger's on the autism spectrum?
Yes.
Because, okay, I've heard it both ways before.
Now, I'm supposed to use high functioning autism in place of,
Of Asperger's, okay.
he actually was from Vienna, Germany, and it's probably actually Asperger. But nobody says it right, so we use Asperger. Here's what I tell families. Your child, I have to say high functioning autism. That's what we usually call Asperger's syndrome. You can use whatever you think with his extended family that would explain it best. I'm going to use high functioning autism. I don't have a problem when I use